Welcome to episode 2 of Planet Shmearth, still spinning, still steaming, still deeply unqualified for life, and yet here we are, roughly 3.6 billion years ago. Give or take a few million, because no one was keeping a calendar. The Earth has finally stopped melting long enough to form crust. The oceans are full of chemical soup, and somehow, against everyone's better judgment, life is beginning. Not the fun kind, not with legs or eyes or any grasp of self-respect. We're talking microbes, tiny sacs of molecules, doing their best to survive in an environment designed by a sleep-deprived volcano. These early life forms are barely distinguishable from non-life. They wobble, they split, they metabolize just enough to keep being disappointing. Most of them hang around hydrothermal vents because if you're going to invent life, why not do it in a scalding hole at the bottom of the ocean? These vents spit out hot water, poisonous gas, and enough minerals to make an entire generation of bacteria feel like they're thriving. And down here, surrounded by death soup and volcanic breath, the microbes figure out how to live without sunlight. They use hydrogen sulfide, which smells like regret to power chemical reactions that keep them barely alive. This is chemosynthesis, which is basically cooking without fire or ingredients. But hey, it works. They eat the gas, build their bodies, divide and repeat forever. Meanwhile, up in the shallow pools, something worse is happening. A few show-off microbes stumble onto photosynthesis. The idea is simple: use sunlight, steal carbon, make sugar, ruin everything. These little innovators are early cyanobacteria, and they don't care about the consequences of their actions. As they bask in sunlight, like algae at a spa, they release oxygen, not on purpose, just as a waste product. But Earth is not ready for oxygen. It is a reducing planet, built for methane, hydrogen, and the occasional plasma belch. Oxygen is reactive, unstable, and not invited, so it starts reacting with iron in the oceans, turning it into rust, which promptly sinks to the ocean floor. Over time, these rust deposits build up layer after layer until the seafloor becomes a passive-aggressive reminder that life has gone too far. But the microbes don't care. They just keep photosynthesizing because that's what life does when it learns a new trick. It overdoes it. Back in the vents, the chemosynthesizers are annoyed. Their cozy little sulfur economy is being invaded by oxygen, which is like pouring bleach into a wine tasting. Some try to adapt, most don't. They either retreat or dissolve. Meanwhile, the oxygen levels rise very slowly, like a conspiracy theory gaining traction. And with it comes a new kind of metabolism, aerobic respiration. The process of taking sugar, mixing it with oxygen, and squeezing out way more energy than ever before. It's the metabolic equivalent of discovering caffeine, and a few lucky microbes are now running on rocket fuel. They outcompete their neighbors, expand, and evolve faster because nothing motivates change like survival and spite. With all this energy, some cells start to get ideas. Not big ones, but enough to rearrange their insides. Some form internal membranes, tiny compartments to keep their chaos organized. Others absorb smaller microbes, and instead of digesting them, they keep them around to help. One of those freeloaders becomes the mitochondrion, a permanent house guest that pays rent in energy. This accidental merger creates the first eukaryotic cells, still simple, still ugly, but now slightly more structured and more powerful than anything that came before. And while all this microscopic drama plays out, the ocean changes. The upper layers are now oxygenated, at least a little. Just enough to stress out every anaerobe trying to mind its own business. The atmosphere is still mostly carbon dioxide, but oxygen is starting to poke through, cautiously like a chemical, trying not to get blamed for something. It reacts with methane, which was keeping the planet warm and slowly cools the climate, just enough to make things even less comfortable. The microbes don't notice. They're too busy forming slimy mats along the seafloor. These mats stack over time, trap sediment, and harden into stromatolites, which are basically the Earth's first attempt at construction and also its first architectural mistake. They're not pretty, they're not useful, but they are everywhere, like the strip malls of the Proterozoic. And that's where we are now. An ocean full of chemical bullies burning sunlight, exhaling poison, and inventing biology by accident. So life exists, and unfortunately, it refuses to stop. The oceans are now thick with microbial mats, blanketing every shallow inch of coastline like an evolutionary rash. Cyanobacteria are still the main characters, photosynthesizing like there's no tomorrow. Mostly because they don't understand the concept of tomorrow. They suck in sunlight, sneeze out oxygen, and feel zero remorse. The atmosphere doesn't know what to do with any of this. It's still mostly carbon dioxide, still hot, still gassy, still deeply offended by the presence of oxygen. But now oxygen is leaking into the air, slowly, awkwardly. Like someone trying to leave a party without saying goodbye. And while the air changes, so does the chemistry of the ocean, the remaining iron. Once happily floating around in solution has been oxidized into oblivion. There's nothing left for the oxygen to react with. So it stays, it builds. And every time a cell photosynthesizes, the planet tips a little further into an accidental atmospheric crisis. Meanwhile, the anaerobes, the original freeloaders are quietly suffocating. Their cozy low-oxygen paradise is collapsing. Shoved aside by the new oxygen-huffing elites, some hide in mud. Some find refuge in deep-sea vents. Some just explode and call it a day. But a few, always a few, start mutating. Some develop enzymes to tolerate oxygen. Barely others adopt new metabolic strategies. Painfully, but the ones that matter are the ones that lean in. They embrace the oxygen and use it to break down food like pros. Their reward: ridiculous amounts of energy. Enough to build things, move around, and become even harder to kill. These are the aerobic microbes, cocky efficient, and chemically superior. With all that, power cells begin to change internally. We see compartmentalization, membranes, channels, storage pockets. Nothing impressive, but it's the start of cells getting their act together. And then the weird stuff happens. One cell engulfs another. And instead of digesting it, they sign an invisible lease agreement. The one inside keeps making energy. The one outside handles everything else. This is how mitochondria show up. The original biological outsourcing. It's clumsy, it's gross, but it works. And suddenly we've got eukaryotes, still one-celled, still sad, but now with internal structure and delusions of grandeur. While this is happening, the microbial mats keep expanding, layering themselves into stromatolites. One microbial corpse at a time. These rocky blobs are the closest thing Earth has to monuments, towering a few inches above the muck, whispering, "We were here, we didn't care, but we were here." In other parts of the ocean, cells are forming chains, not for strategy, but because they forgot how to let go. Some divide, but fail to separate. Some stick together because they secrete glue. Some just drift into clumps out of pure microbial laziness. This is not cooperation, this is spatial confusion. but it opens the door to specialization, to community, to the long, slow, agonizing road toward multicellular life, which, just to be clear, is not happening yet. Right now, everything is still wet, still microscopic, still metabolizing in circles, but things are getting more layered, more chemically interesting, more tragically stable. The surface of the Earth remains hostile. The continents, such as they are just scattered crust rafts drifting through magma oceans, farting out volcanoes and shaking like unstable furniture. The sky is full of volcanic gas. The rain is slightly acidic, and every few million years, a meteor shows up to remind life who's in charge. And yet somehow the microbes keep going. They divide, they mutate, they leak, they adapt. They keep reshaping the planet, not with purpose, not with intention, but with sheer biochemical repetition. We are still in the billion-year puddle, still watching single-celled organisms struggle their way through the longest awkward phase in the history of existence. It is now about 3.54 billion years ago, and Earth remains deeply unprepared for guests. The surface is a patchwork of boiling vents, bare rock and shallow pools filled with light-sensitive slime. Nothing breathes air. Nothing has bones, nothing even knows it exists. But something very stupid and very important is happening. Microbes, for reasons no one asked them to explain, have begun to leave behind chemical fingerprints. Isotopic ratios are shifting, sulfur behaves differently. Carbon starts doing things it definitely wasn't doing in lifeless conditions. The rocks are recording it all. Because even if life is bad at existing, geology is worse at forgetting. And down in the ocean, the microbial mat economy is booming. Whole seafloors are covered in sticky carpets of competing photosynthesizers, layered colonies living, dying, hardening, and rebuilding again, each layer slightly more hostile than the last. Oxygen continues to rise, not fast. Not in a fun way, just slowly, annoyingly, relentlessly. The surviving anaerobes are now specialists, living in narrow slices of the environment where oxygen is kept out, or at least ignored. They become the original extremists, thriving in heat, salt acidity, and anywhere else that smells like a chemical spill. Meanwhile, the oxygen lovers are thriving in open waters, metabolizing like they invented energy, out-competing everything slower and forming new versions of internal chaos. Some of them evolve tiny hairs for swimming because sitting still is now inefficient. Others grow sensors for light or chemicals because apparently now it matters where you are. The variety is increasing barely, but enough that we can stop pretending all microbes are the same grey puddle. And then, as if this needed to be more dramatic, life starts messing with nitrogen. Some microbes figure out how to take nitrogen gas from the air, break it apart, and use it to build proteins. This is called nitrogen fixation, and it's as ridiculous as it sounds. You take an inert gas, rip it open using enzymes that hate oxygen, and turn it into fertilizer. Of course, most organisms can't do this. They just steal fixed nitrogen from the ones that can, which, if we're being honest, will become the entire structure of future ecosystems. Produce a useful chemical. Watch everyone else show up to mooch. Meanwhile, the oceans are full of chemical gradients, layers of light, temperature, oxygen, and nutrients, and life. Being opportunistic, stacks itself accordingly. Photosynthesizers at the top, sulfur users at the bottom, everything else crammed somewhere in between, trying not to die too obviously. Even the microbial mats are getting stratified. Sun-facing cells on the outside. Oxygen-hating cells on the inside. Dead cells in the middle because someone has to absorb the consequences. It is not organized but it works. And on rare occasions, lightning still strikes the ocean, meteors still punch the crust, and volcanoes still make sure the planet remembers how to panic. But none of it stops the microbes. They just absorb, adapt, and continue exhaling molecules that will eventually cause another extinction. Because this is what life does. It shows up, it makes waste, and then it dares the environment to keep up. It is now around 3.52 billion years ago, and somehow this planet has not exploded, frozen, or rage quit itself into space. Instead, it is hosting an uninterrupted microbial tantrum. The oceans are basically a broth of ambition and slime, still hot, still acidic, still deeply unappetizing. And floating through this chemical soup are cells, thousands of types, most of them extremely proud of doing exactly one thing slightly better than the others. Some absorb light, some eat sulfur, some just float and hope nothing touches them. But one group, as usual, is ruining the curve for everyone else. The Cyanobacteria. They are photosynthesizing like it's a personal brand. Still producing oxygen, still not asking if that's a good idea. By now, oxygen levels are creeping high enough to start forming trace amounts of ozone, just a thin shimmer in the upper atmosphere, but it's the beginning of a UV filter, which is great because before this, Earth was basically being microwaved from space, and yet, nothing seems to care. These microbes with no eyes, no thoughts, no plans are casually terraforming the planet, one sneeze of oxygen at a time. The atmosphere is changing, the ocean chemistry is changing, even the crust is changing, because life won't stop pooping out elements that bond with minerals. Sulfur cycles get weird. Iron starts disappearing, methane drops, and with it, so does the planet's temperature. That's right. These little sun-guzzling blobs have accidentally triggered the first whispers of climate change. Because Earth, like most things, gets cold when you delete its methane blanket and replace it with regret, but it's not frozen yet, it's just moody. Rain still falls, salty, slightly toxic, full of whatever chemicals the volcanoes forgot to burn off. Continents are barely trying, more like oversized scabs drifting across a simmering wound. Occasionally they bump into each other, mountains rise, sediment shifts, and everything immediately gets eroded back into the sea like it never mattered. Life, of course, is unfazed. Microbes don't care about continents. They care about gradients. Where's the light? Where's the heat? Where's the molecule I can exploit? And so they move. Not with legs, not with purpose, but with diffusion and desperation. Some even start building protective shells, microscopic armor made of minerals, possibly to survive, possibly just to look busy. Others begin signaling chemically like ants with no plan, releasing molecules that trigger reactions in neighbors. It's not thought, it's not communication. It's just chemical gossip, and it works well enough to keep them from exploding. Meanwhile, down at the vents, the old-school microbes are still there, still huffing sulfur, still refusing to join the oxygen cult. They've become specialists, living in brutal environments, heat, pressure, poison, and they love it. These are the Extremophiles, the weirdos, the stubborn leftovers from before oxygen ruined everything. And honestly, they're thriving in their own miserable way. Elsewhere, microbial colonies continue to evolve structure. Some form loose stacks with division of labor. Outer cells defend inner cells, reproduce. Middle cells just sit there and try not to leak. Still not multicellular, but definitely considering it. And that's what this era is, 100 million years of considering things. Considering movement, considering complexity, considering maybe not dying immediately. Most of it fails, but a few things stick. A few new genes, a few new enzymes, a few slightly better membranes. Enough to keep going, because on planet Shmearth, if you're not dissolving, you're evolving. It is now about 3.5 billion years ago, and Earth, this hot, wet marble of nonsense, has officially been hosting life for over 100 million years, which sounds impressive until you remember it's still all slime. No eyes, no teeth, no sounds, just a planet-sized aquarium full of chemical entitlement. The Cyanobacteria, still undefeated, have completely taken over the photic zone. That's the top layer of the ocean. For those of you who aren't fluent in ancient algae real estate, they continue to inhale sunlight, exhale oxygen, and ruin things for everyone who liked their Earth. Anoxic and cozy. The oxygen, now too abundant to ignore, has begun creeping into everything. It's in the water, it's in the sediment, it's starting to show up in the atmosphere like it owns the place. This is a problem for most life, which evolved in a low-oxygen world and now finds itself chemically betrayed. Anaerobic microbes are cornered, outpaced, and slowly deleted from every environment that doesn't actively hate oxygen. The oxygen-tolerant microbes, on the other hand, are having an absolute energy party. With oxygen, they burn food for 30 times the yield, which means more growth, more mutation, and more innovation, if you can call it that. Some begin to specialize further. A few develop primitive sensory systems, basically glorified molecule detectors, but still, a step up from floating aimlessly and hoping for food to bump into you. Some microbes even begin to glide. Not swim, not wriggle, just glide, like passive-aggressive slugs powered by chemical gradients. And somewhere in a warm, coastal slime pile, a single-celled organism makes a choice it can never undo. It engulfs another cell and instead of digesting it, keeps it alive, permanently. The swallowed cell. Probably a free-living bacterium, continues making energy, and the host cell, too tired to question this arrangement, just lets it happen. This is the birth of mitochondria and, more importantly, the birth of the first real eukaryotes. Still single-celled, still ugly, but now with compartments, which in biology is basically a personality. These early eukaryotes are structurally fancy. They've got a nucleus, they've got organelles, they've got a scheduling problem. Because being more complex means more can go wrong, but also more can evolve. They're still floating, still dividing, still doing absolutely nothing that would entertain you. But they represent potential, which on this planet is just code for eventually, something worse is coming. Meanwhile, on the seafloor, stromatolites continue to grow, layer by layer, century by century, sticky mats of microbes stacking on top of themselves until they form lumpy towers of fossilized arrogance. These structures are everywhere now, dominating shallow marine environments, trapping sediment, and occasionally fossilizing whatever was too slow to move out of the way. If you could time travel here, which you should absolutely not, you'd see entire coastlines coated in stromatolites, breathing, pulsing and reeking like a compost bin left in the sun. No coral, no sand, no shells, just rocks, water, and the kind of biofilm that haunts microscopes. But while the surface world is suffocating in oxygen, the deep ocean is still holding out. Hydrothermal vents remain untouched, dark hot, and completely indifferent to the oxygen drama upstairs, the microbes here. The Extremophiles are still thriving in brutal silence. They run on sulfur, they ignore sunlight, they laugh in the face of pH levels that would peel paint off a car. They are ancient, they are unchanged, and they will absolutely still be here long after your species deletes itself. Back at the surface, the new atmosphere is starting to do weird things. Tiny amounts of ozone begin to form, blocking a fraction of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, which is great news for life and terrible news for cosmic sterilization. For the first time, shallow waters aren't instantly lethal. Land is still a scorched nightmare, but now it's a slightly less radioactive nightmare. Microbes notice because they notice everything, and a few begin creeping into damp shoreline rocks, forming biofilms in cracks, hiding in mineral pores, experimenting with the concept of not living underwater. They don't make it far, but they try. And on this planet, trying is apparently all you need. And so ends this chapter. Not with an explosion, not with a breakthrough, just more slime, more chemical overreach, and the quiet arrogance of life doing whatever it wants, wherever it can. It is still 3.5 billion years ago, because nothing exciting has happened, and time has no respect for your attention span. The entire planet remains a humid orb of biological audacity wrapped in storm clouds, sulfur vapor, and whatever leftover atmosphere wasn't oxidized out of existence yet. The oceans are still the main event, shallow coastal waters lined with microbial mats thick enough to trip over deep sea vents, burping heat and minerals into microbial mouths. Everywhere you look, there's something oozing. Photosynthesizers dominate the top layers. Oxygen lovers lounge smugly in the upper water columns, and the anaerobes, once rulers, are now basement dwellers, forced into sediments and sulfur pits like biological conspiracy theorists. The atmosphere is shifting slowly, painfully from a suffocating greenhouse mix to a slightly less suffocating cocktail of gases that almost resembles breathable air. If you're a microbe with no lungs and very low standards, the oxygen isn't just reacting with metals anymore, it's starting to mess with everything: organic matter, volcanic gases, even sunlight. The sky begins to tint slightly blue, very slightly. Not that anyone can see it, but it's there. A faint signal that the planet is rebranding. Meanwhile, back in the shallows, the microbial world is testing out complexity, but in the most microbial way possible. Some eukaryotes start forming temporary groupings, chains, blobs, clumps of cells that didn't bother to finish separating after division. These aren't organisms, they're organizational accidents. But even organizational accidents can get traction in a world with no rules, and so these loose cell colonies begin to experiment. Some cells start doing one thing, others do something else, and together they form something barely more efficient than being alone. It's not teamwork, it's forced proximity. But the moment one cell sacrifices its own replication to help another, even a little, that's the start of something dangerous. Specialization, still rare, still unstable, still likely to collapse after 2 generations. But it exists. And once something exists, evolution refuses to let it go. Elsewhere, the nitrogen cycle is now fully operational, which to most life is irrelevant. But to microbes, it is free real estate. Nitrogen fixers are breaking apart triple bonds in atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into something usable, because apparently the most stable gas in the sky needed to be violently repurposed. And the rest of the ecosystem, if you can call it that, immediately becomes dependent on this one weird trick. Suddenly, you can build more proteins, copy more genes, grow slightly faster than the microbe next to you, and that, as always, is enough to justify anything. Meanwhile, volcanoes continue their part-time job as planetary trauma, spewing ash, sulfur dioxide, and enough carbon to confuse the atmosphere for another few million years. The continents are still half-formed, drifting, cracking, sometimes pretending to be stable only to split again out of spite. They support no soil, no plants, no animals, only rocks, water, and the occasional biofilm stubborn enough to crust onto a tide pool. And those biofilms, by the way, are getting bolder. A few brave microbes, mostly cyanobacteria with nothing left to lose, are making excursions onto damp rocks just above sea level. They find moisture minerals and mild UV protection from the barely there ozone layer and decide, sure, this will do. It won't. They dry out, they die. They get washed away by waves and forgotten by time. But they try again and again, because no one told them they shouldn't. That is how life works on planet Shmearth. It doesn't improve, it doesn't plan, it just repeats itself until the environment gives up. It is still 3.5 billion years ago because Earth operates on a schedule made of spite and lava. And in case you were hoping for progress, still no animals, still no plants, still nothing that blinks or breathes or bothers to form a skeleton, just microbes. So many microbes. All of them extremely committed to being slightly less pathetic than their neighbors. Cyanobacteria remain the unchallenged champions of the shallow seas, covering coastlines in a thick layer of mucus optimism. They have not stopped photosynthesizing, not once, not for one single day. Because why evolve when you can just outnumber everyone else? The oxygen they produce continues to saturate the oceans, creeping into every available molecule like a passive-aggressive gas leak. Iron is long gone, sulfur is losing ground, and carbon is being restructured into newer, stranger, more oxidized things. The ocean floor is now fully crusted with rust, and microbes are learning to adapt to their own pollution. Some microbes start growing structures, little stalks, ridges, even mineralized shells, not to look pretty, but to anchor themselves in the microbial mat-arms race. You want light, you go up, you want nutrients, you dig down, you want to not die, you hold your spot with goo and attitude. Meanwhile, the early eukaryotes are doing their best to matter. They're still one-celled, still floating, still learning how not to explode under pressure. But now they've got mitochondria, they've got a nucleus, and most importantly, they've got free time. That free time means experimenting with shape size and just how many organelles they can stuff inside themselves before things go sideways. Some grow flagella, little whip-like tails for movement because floating aimlessly is starting to feel a bit amateur. Others grow cilia, tiny hair-like structures for wiggling around like microscopic Roombas, cleaning nothing, solving nothing, but looking extremely busy. A few even try engulfing other cells on purpose, which is not eating, it's predation, a brand new idea in a world that has never seen teeth. These first predators are just larger blobs, absorbing smaller blobs, digesting them and calling it innovation, and like everything else, once it works, it spreads. Now the oceans are home to an arms race of cellular nonsense. Some grow faster, some swim faster, some just become very good at being slippery. It is still silent, still slow, still microscopic. But evolution has officially found violence. Elsewhere, the Stromatolites keep rising layer after layer of dead cells, live cells, and sand glued together by hope and mucus. They're now several inches tall, which doesn't sound like much unless you're a cell, in which case it's Everest. They dominate the coastlines and quietly change everything around them. Their oxygen leaks into the water, their structure traps sediment, their surface becomes habitat, even their decay becomes fuel. They are the architects of the microbial landscape. Accidentally, as usual. Meanwhile, the atmosphere continues its slow identity crisis. There is now just enough oxygen, just enough ozone, and just enough lowered UV radiation to make the upper tidal zone survivable for at least a few hours, and so a few pioneering microbes step, or rather, smear onto land. They creep into cracks, crawl across moist stone and hide in mineral films, and begin the long, stupid journey toward terrestrial life. They have no limbs, no lungs, no plan. But they do not die immediately, which on this planet is called success. We are still 3.5 billion years ago, because even geological time gets stuck sometimes. The planet is stable in the way a hot stove is stable. It won't explode, but it is definitely not comfortable. The land is bare, just rocks, volcanoes, occasional steam vents, and the faint smell of regret. No dirt, no roots, no footprints, just silence and heat, and the occasional bacterial smear pretending this counts as colonization. A few microbial pioneers, mostly cyanobacteria with boundary issues, have started crusting onto the edges of tidal zones. They find damp spots in the cracks of rocks, and they hold on with protein glue, with mineral coatings, with sheer spite. These land-adjacent mats are thin, fragile, and mostly dead by sunset, but every now and then, one survives just long enough to replicate. And so land colonization begins, not with a march but with a smear. Back in the oceans, things are getting crowded. Microbial mats are growing over microbial mats. Layered, twisted, stacked like the world's worst lasagna. Every surface is claimed, every niche is occupied. Every patch of light is contested by a billion photosynthetic blobs trying to be the first to die slightly higher than the rest. Some start forming hollow colonies, little spheres with an internal space, because apparently reinventing the water balloon was a tactical advantage. Others go flat, thin films that glide across surfaces like passive-aggressive pancakes. This is not intelligent design. It is evolutionary spaghetti thrown at the wall to see what sticks, and what sticks becomes life. Meanwhile, the eukaryotes are becoming more common. They're still microscopic, still mostly useless, but now they've got options. They split their genes differently. They control their membranes more precisely. They start forming networks of filaments inside their cells because complexity, like mold, will always find a place to grow. A few eukaryotes begin forming colonies, not accidental clumps, but deliberate associations, cells sticking together, dividing labor, specializing slightly. One absorbs light, another moves nutrients. A third just sits there looking overworked and underpaid. It's not multicellularity yet, but it is dangerously close to competence. And just when things couldn't get weirder, some cells start hoarding chloroplasts. Yes, the old cyanobacteria trick of using sunlight gets absorbed literally by eukaryotes that decide eating photosynthetic bacteria is easier than learning photosynthesis. And so another endosymbiosis is born, the chloroplast, an enslaved cyanobacterium forever trapped inside a host cell, making sugar on demand, like a photosynthetic vending machine. This opens the door to the first photosynthetic eukaryotes. Now there are two major clades of light eaters, one that invented it and one that stole it. Welcome to biology. And while this is happening, the atmosphere continues to oxidize, slowly, invisibly, chemically. Ozone builds UV radiation drops, and the surface becomes slightly less uninhabitable. There is now enough oxygen that if you could breathe it, you still couldn't, but it might sting less on the way down. No one notices, because no one has lungs or nerves or opinions. But the chemistry keeps shifting, and life, oblivious as always, keeps adapting. We are still exactly 3.5 billion years ago because this planet refuses to move on until every microbe has had a turn. At this point, the oceans are fully colonized by things that do not know they are colonizing anything. They just float and divide and clog every possible surface with film, scum, and ambition. The coastal waters are an ecosystem now, which is a fancy word for chemical chaos that hasn't collapsed yet. At the top, cyanobacteria ride the light, burning photons, exhaling oxygen, and feeling good about themselves for reasons no one else can verify. Beneath them, oxygen-tolerant aerobes, sucking in that sweet, sweet molecular O2 like its exclusive content, running high-energy metabolism, replicating aggressively, and looking down on their sulfur-eating ancestors with biochemical contempt. Lower still, in the shaded sediment, the anaerobes cling to relevance, avoiding oxygen, avoiding light, avoiding having to explain what went wrong. And at the very bottom, in vents and deep cracks, the Extremophiles, still unchanged, still proud, still doing chemosynthesis and pretending everyone else sold out. This is the New World Order. And nobody planned it. There are no predators, no prey, no screaming, just gradients and osmosis and molecules that are getting way too comfortable in their roles. But something else is creeping in now, structure. Some of the eukaryotic colonies are getting more organized cells on the outside. Hardened cells on the inside do the messy stuff, and a few cells stop dividing altogether. Which in evolutionary terms is borderline heroic. These aren't multicellular organisms, but they are thinking about it in that way that microbes think, which is just doing something enough times that it accidentally becomes a system. Elsewhere, photosynthetic eukaryotes. Now equipped with chloroplasts, they did not invent, are spreading through the water like freeloading interns with a decent energy budget. They are larger, slower, and more complicated, which makes them a terrible evolutionary idea, but just useful enough to not go extinct. Some grow protective shells using calcium silica or whatever minerals are laying around. Not because they're afraid, but because being spiky and hard is a great way to avoid being absorbed by accident. And now, for the first time, the oceans begin to show visible life. Still tiny, still silent, still extremely unimpressive, but technically visible if you squint at a drop of seawater under a rock and believe in magic. Meanwhile, the oxygen continues to climb, pushed out into the air. No longer content to hang out in the ocean. The methane, which once kept the planet nice and warm, is breaking down, reacting with oxygen and triggering the first hints of climate instability. Not ice ages. Not yet, but the beginning of a pattern, where life changes the atmosphere and the atmosphere punishes everyone for it. On land, the rocks are still bear-cracked, occasionally wet, rarely lucky enough to host a biofilm that hasn't evaporated. But every so often, in a shaded crevice, a few cyanobacteria hold on and replicate and dry out and die, then do it again. Over time, the rocks begin to show staining pigments, organic crusts, and chemical traces of microbial defiance. This is the very beginning of land-based life. Not in the way you're picturing, but in the way microbes do everything, quietly, accidentally, and with absolutely no idea what they're starting. The year is still 3.5 billion BCE, because apparently nothing better has come along to replace it. The planet has now been alive, in the technical sense, for over 100 million years, and so far, all it has to show for it is slime that won't shut up. The oceans are full, not of fish or anything with a spine, but of cells, so many cells layered, slimy, passive-aggressive layers of cells. The top layers still belong to the photosynthesizers, mostly cyanobacteria, still belching oxygen, still acting like they invented light. Below them, oxygen respirers are gobbling up sugar like it's going out of style, burning energy fast, multiplying faster, and giving zero credit to the archaea they stole half their metabolism from. The eukaryotes are still weird, still new. Still figuring out where all their membranes go, but they're not rare anymore. They've spread and diversified and picked up a few tricks along the way, like phagocytosis, the highly advanced skill of wrapping your membrane around something and absorbing it whole. It's not graceful, it's not ethical, but it gets the job done. Some of these eukaryotes are now hunters, or at least they pretend to be. They drift through the water, sniffing out weaker cells, engulfing them, digesting them, and moving on with all the subtlety of a vacuum cleaner full of soup. Meanwhile, other eukaryotes are going full hippie, floating in the sun, living off their chloroplasts, and forming loose networks of cells that almost look like they have goals. Almost. In the shallows, stromatolites continue to rise, craggy towers of photosynthetic trash stacked up over centuries, still being made one dead cell at a time. Some reach a foot high, which is absurd. If you're a single cell, a foot is a skyscraper, a foot is a god. And in these structures, life continues to stack and shed and exhale, each layer creating the conditions for the next, like scaffolding for a future no one asked for. Out in the open ocean, drifting mats of photosynthetic goo now stretch for miles. Some break off and float, rafts of biomass that carry ecosystems with them, which is a polite way of saying rafts of stuff that smells like low tide and ambition. Down in the mud, things are fermenting. Anaerobic life still exists, clinging to every anoxic microenvironment it can find, the last refuges of a chemical past that refuses to die. These microbes are still using sulfur, still producing methane, still living like nothing ever changed. But change is coming because the methane, once the warm, cozy blanket of early Earth, is now under attack. The oxygen, persistent, rude, and extremely reactive, is breaking down methane in the atmosphere, turning it into carbon dioxide, which is less effective at trapping heat. And just like that, the planet begins to cool, not fast, not dramatically, just enough to make things inconvenient. The first real signs of climate sensitivity emerge. A hint that life and the environment are now in a deeply codependent toxic relationship. Oxygen goes up, methane goes down, temperature drops, life adapts or doesn't. And Earth still spinning, still volcanic, still mostly ocean keeps letting it all happen. Because this planet doesn't care what life does as long as it doesn't stop. The clock is still frozen at 3.5 billion years ago because the planet refuses to admit that progress should move faster than erosion. At this point, Earth is basically a high school group project. One person doing all the work, and everyone else waiting to mutate into something useful. Cyanobacteria are still leading the charge, mostly because they got there first, and partly because they're too simple to understand the concept of restraint. They continue to dominate the surface of the oceans, unrolling like green carpets of photosynthetic arrogance. Every second, they take in sunlight and spit out oxygen like they're being paid in exposure. The atmosphere, once a chaotic stew of volcanic gases and murder, is now noticeably shifting. There's still carbon dioxide, still nitrogen, still a bit of methane clinging to its last scraps of relevance. But now, there's oxygen. Real oxygen, enough that molecules in the air are beginning to complain about it. Not enough to breathe, not enough to party, but enough to rust your tools. If you had tools, or hands, or opposable thumbs, which of course you don't because you're still a microbe. Somewhere in this bubbling wet soup of consequences, a eukaryote tries something new. Instead of just living and dividing, it stays attached to its sibling, then its cousin, then its increasingly specialized neighbor. And somehow it all doesn't fall apart. One cell starts absorbing nutrients, another moves, another just kind of sits there, holding everything together. For the first time, a colony of cells starts pretending to be one thing instead of 50 identical things in a trench coat. This is not a multicellular organism, but it's not that either. It's just functional enough to qualify as foreshadowing, and while these colonies experiment with division of labor, other microbes are digging deeper into biochemistry, literally. Some figure out how to use nitrates instead of oxygen, others refine fermentation, and a few even figure out how to detoxify the very oxygen that's been murdering their relatives for centuries. They don't get awards, but they do get survival, and that, on this planet, is the only form of validation that exists. The oceans, now filled with gradients of everything, are beginning to behave like structured environments instead of one big chemical soup. At the surface, light oxygen, photosynthesis, smugness. In the middle, transition zones, oxidation events, a constant war between tolerances. At the bottom, anoxiosulfur and the comforting hiss of vents that never bothered evolving. Life is now stacked, layered, territorially passive-aggressive. And in this chaos, predation becomes a thing. Not hunting, not jaws, just one cell engulfing another because it's hungry or bored or confused. Some of these predators become large by microbial standards, which means just big enough to be seen under a microscope with a good attitude. They glide through the water, sniffing out signals, absorbing victims, and leaving trails of dissolved regret. In response, other microbes develop defenses. Some grow thicker walls, some spin faster, some just leak toxins and hope for the best. The arms race has officially begun, and no one even has arms yet. Meanwhile, on land, cyanobacteria continue their painful experiments with living outside water. They coat damp surfaces, hide in rock pores, and trap themselves in salt crusts that almost count as homes. They die constantly. Dry out, blow away, get scorched. But every time some make it back, and over a few million years, that's all that matters. Life doesn't conquer land. It seeps into it, one dead cell at a time. We are still standing firmly in the middle of 3.5 billion years ago, because apparently life has decided to develop at the speed of sediment. By now, the Earth is fully coated in disappointment, and that disappointment is alive. The oceans, the shallow tidal flats, the muddy sea floor, even the occasional puddle clinging to the edge of a steaming volcanic rock, all of it covered in biofilm. Not in a cool way. There are no fins, no tentacles, no screaming, just a dense green slimy bureaucracy of single-celled organisms quietly wrecking the chemical composition of the entire planet. The cyanobacteria, as always, are the loudest, without actually making a sound, still churning out oxygen, still forming mats, still pretending that being photosynthetic is a personality. They're not evolving. They don't need to. They're already winning. And because they're winning, everything else has to figure out how to survive in a world that's slowly becoming uninhabitable for the things that lived in it first. Anaerobes now live in shadow, in mud, in the bottoms of lakes that don't technically exist yet. They ferment, they bubble, they mutate just fast enough to avoid extinction. Meanwhile, the oxygen lovers are thriving. Using their mitochondria, their stolen cellular batteries, to crank out energy like it's on clearance. They move, they sense, they engulf. Some grow long tails, to swim to escape, to chase things with no expressions and no mercy. Predation at the scale of molecules. One cell absorbs another, dissolves, it moves on. Not for fun, not for sport, just because it can. Other cells respond, they get armor, they excrete slime, some spin so fast they become basically uncatchable. This is how ecosystems form. Not with beauty, not with balance, but with chemical escalation. And still, no eyes, no brains, no coordination. Just instincts and membranes and molecules getting slightly better at not dying. Deeper in the ocean, at the hydrothermal vents, life continues, unaffected, because these microbes never cared about oxygen anyway. They're still eating sulfur, still ignoring sunlight, still living at 300 degrees Celsius in total darkness like it's no big deal. They don't evolve quickly, they don't need to. They already found hell and decided to make it home. Elsewhere, a few eukaryotes are taking the multicell thing too far. Their colonies are getting tighter, more permanent. A few cells stop reproducing entirely, just so the others can keep the blob alive. This is specialization. This is delegation. This is the evolutionary equivalent of someone volunteering to do taxes, so the rest of the group can vibe. Still not animals, still not plants, but now dangerously close to becoming infrastructure. The rest of the microbial world doesn't care, it never has, it never will. But these little blobs with their internal compartments and their stolen chloroplasts and their frankly overcomplicated reproduction methods are the future. Not a good future, but a different one. And speaking of the future, the oxygen still increasing. It's now high enough to start triggering mineral changes on land iron, turns red rocks weather differently, new types of clay form because, apparently, even the dirt has opinions about gas concentrations now. The atmosphere isn't breathable, but it's oxidizing. Every raindrop is now slightly acidic. Every exposed surface begins reacting, rusting, crumbling, becoming slightly less like the surface of Mars and slightly more like a planet trying to clean itself. But there are no plants to hold the soil. No roots, no bark, no trees to wave dramatically in the sulfur-laced breeze. Just microbes, trying and failing to be the first thing that matters on land. They cling to rocks, to salt crystals, to damp crevices on volcanic ridges, and they form colonies, paper-thin layers of life, cracked, flaky, photosynthetic hope with no structural integrity. They dry out, they die, they come back. Because dying has never been a deal-breaker for bacteria. And so land colonization continues, one failed attempt at a time. The year is still 3.5 billion BCE because time here moves slower than a eukaryote trying to decide which way is forward. At this point, life has had over 100 million years to do something. Anything. And what it has produced is a wet mat of attitude and metabolic arrogance. Let's start where we always do, with Cyanobacteria, because of course it's them. They are still the loudest, still the most annoying, still blanketing every square inch of shallow water with their little green ego factories. Every photon that hits the ocean surface is inhaled, processed, and exhaled as oxygen. which continues to float through the world like a chemical that doesn't know how to read the room. The air is now just oxygen enough to rust your tools, still not oxygen enough to breathe. Not that anyone has lungs or tools or the desire to breathe. This trace oxygen continues to do what it always does. It reacts with sulfur, with methane, with metals, with anything that used to be chill and inert. The planet is being chemically exfoliated by invisible microbes who do not care, who do not stop, who do not even know they're doing it. Meanwhile, the eukaryotes are starting to develop main character syndrome. Their membranes are more complex. Their insides are more organized, and they are absolutely convinced they deserve more screen time. Some of them are now permanently photosynthetic, thanks to those chloroplasts they didn't invent, but definitely kept. Others have decided to eat their neighbors, not for fun, not out of spite, just because that's how you get calories now. Predation has become normal, which means defense has become necessary. Cells start building better walls. Some get spikes, some get slippery, some just divide faster and hope not to be the one that gets digested. It's all very efficient, very gross and deeply unsatisfying to watch. But it's working. The microbial ecosystem is now complex and territorial. Shallow water is where the cyanobacteria flex. Midwater is where the oxygen lovers glide. The bottom is where the ancient holdouts ferment in the dark, and the eukaryotes, still rare, still dramatic, float between the layers, pretending they're above it all. Some of them are even forming slime colonies, groups of cells that stick together on purpose, with channels, compartments, division of labor, and zero communication skills. One group gathers light, one group moves waste, one group just takes up space and insists they're important. It's not multicellularity, but it's absolutely corporate. Elsewhere, nitrogen fixation has gone mainstream. Microbes are pulling nitrogen out of the air, breaking it down, and turning it into ammonia, which is great, because everything else on Earth has apparently decided to run on nitrogen now. And like all useful molecules, the ones that make it get stolen, replicated, improved, and immediately abused by freeloaders. Now, every drop of ocean has its own little nitrogen economy with producers, consumers, and the chemical equivalent of middle managers who think they deserve credit. On land, if you can call it that, the microbial invasion continues. It's still just rocks, still just crust, still just wind dust, and UV radiation. But life, too stubborn to take a hint, keeps returning. Every rainstorm, every mist, every droplet of condensation in a shaded crack is a potential outpost. Biofilms stretch across wet stone only to dry out, crack, and blow away again and again forever. But occasionally, a few cells survive, and if they survive, they divide. And if they divide, they leave behind pigments, stains, geochemical footprints, that say, yes, something was here briefly. And that is how land gets colonized on this planet. Not with conquest, not with leaps, but with a slow, sticky, evaporating crawl. We are still 3.5 billion years ago, because Earth is not in a rush and neither is life. At this point, the entire biosphere is powered by one thing: accidental persistence. Every inch of ocean, every tide pool, every steaming vent, and every damp crevice on the crust is occupied by something that shouldn't still be alive, but is. The cyanobacteria are still out here, photosynthesizing with zero shame, still producing oxygen like they're being paid per molecule. The oxygen continues to accumulate, which means everything else continues to suffer. Sulfur compounds are breaking down, methane is dropping, and the temperature is slowly, quietly sliding in the wrong direction. The climate is becoming unpredictable. If you're a microbe, this means your favorite puddle now freezes at night and boils at noon. But you stay anyway, because adaptation is just the art of not giving up when the planet clearly hates you. Meanwhile, eukaryotes continue to inflate their egos along with their internal membranes. Some of them have grown shockingly large by microbe standards, which means you can now fit an entire prokaryote inside them, and many do. They keep engulfing, digesting, and sometimes not digesting, which is how symbiosis continues to spread like a bad idea that keeps working. Some cells are now packed with mitochondria, chloroplasts, vacuoles, cytoskeletons, and just enough genetic baggage to make every division a high-risk event. And yet, they thrive. Their complexity gives them options. They can eat, they can photosynthesize, they can move. And for the first time in Earth's history, they can do all three badly but simultaneously. This gives them an edge in the growing microbial free-for-all. Competition is real. Now resources are limited and the oceans are full. So some microbes do what all desperate life forms eventually try. They cheat. They excrete toxins. They jam signaling molecules. They form alliances, only to betray each other at the first sign of stress. It is still all chemical, still all automatic. But the arms race is real, and it is happening at the molecular level. Elsewhere, multicellular behavior is becoming less of a phase and more of a commitment. Some eukaryotic colonies are now passing on group structure through generations. They don't fall apart after reproduction. They don't drift off as individuals. They stay together as clusters with internal structure and distributed tasks. This isn't a slug, it isn't a worm, it isn't anything recognizable, but it is definitely not just a pile of identical cells anymore. They have beginnings and middles and ends, and they die as a unit, which is about as dramatic as it gets for microbes. On the sea floor, the Stromatolites remain undefeated, ancient, unmoving stacks of photosynthetic bacteria cemented in place by calcium dead layers on top of dead layers, living layers just underneath, still farting out oxygen into an environment that didn't ask for it. These formations now cover massive areas of the coastline, like geological acne, slowly altering everything they touch. Sediment builds around them. Water flow changes, light patterns shift, microbes compete for position like sunburned tourists fighting over beach chairs. And over millions of years, the seafloor becomes structured, messy but structured. Land is still barely holding together, just floating plates of rock, crashing, splitting, vomiting lava, and sometimes sitting still just long enough for a few cells to smear themselves across the surface. These land-dwelling pioneers, if you can call them that, are not plants. They are not lichens. They are barely functional. But they manage to crust over rock surfaces, forming dark stains that eat sunlight, hold moisture, and trap dust. They don't thrive, they survive. They build the first thin films of soil, which is a generous term for decomposing cells stuck to pebbles. But it's something, and on this planet, something is always enough to get worse later. We are still at 3.5 billion years ago because the concept of moving on has not yet evolved. At this stage, life is everywhere. And by everywhere, we mean in the grossest, wettest, least photogenic places imaginable. The oceans are fully colonized not by creatures, but by problems with membranes. Every droplet of seawater is now a crowded rave of invisible freeloaders trying to absorb the same nutrients, exhale the same waste, and pretend they were here first. Cyanobacteria are still leading the campaign to make the planet breathable by filling it with a gas that's toxic to most of their peers. They have not stopped, they will not stop, and they do not care. Their slimy mats now blanket the coastal floors, shallow lagoons, and any surface that holds still long enough for them to attach to it with microbial glue. They're not just living, they're engineering accidentally. Their oxygen continues to react with everything: metals, gases, organic molecules. Your patience. The result is a planet in transition, one slow molecule at a time. Meanwhile, eukaryotes are continuing their ongoing rebrand from confused blob to slightly organized blob with ambition. They have internal membranes, cytoskeletons, little engines of energy production, and just enough complexity to be extremely annoying. Some grow long tails, some develop sensors, some start coordinating, because apparently being slightly aware of your surroundings is the new hot trend, and coordination, of course, leads to disaster. Because now some of these eukaryotes are choosing to stay grouped together through generations, through division, through hardship. They become proto-multicellular, still single cells but no longer single-minded. One cell becomes the outer shell, another absorbs nutrients, one divides, one dies. No one's in charge, no one's qualified, but somehow it still works. Barely. Elsewhere, the oceans have developed zones. There's the oxygen-rich photic zone at the top, where the photosynthesizers fight over every inch of sunlight like jealous plants in a crowded window. The middle layers, where competition is chaos and everyone is just trying not to get engulfed. And the deep, where sulfur breathers, methane makers, and grumpy anaerobes sulk in the heat of hydrothermal vents and whisper about the good old days. At the boundaries between these layers, new chemistry emerges, interfaces gradients, places where opposites meet and argue. These are the new frontiers because evolution is petty and every edge is a challenge. And now, for the first time, cells are beginning to specialize, not just as a glitch, but on purpose. One cell type moves, another produces energy, a third handles toxins. Division of labor in a world with no jobs. These colonies are more stable, more productive, and significantly harder to kill. They're still tiny, still ugly, still silent, but they're closer to being something that matters, which is saying a lot, on a planet where everything is still mostly goo. And speaking of goo, the land is now regularly coated with it. Every rain, every splash, every coastal spray leaves behind microbial stains. Most dry out, most die, but some hold on. They form crusts, dark, photosynthetic, crunchy, and faintly resentful. These are Earth's first terrestrial ecosystems, if you can call a smear of bacteria an ecosystem, which, in this case, you can, because these crusts, as pathetic as they look, begin to trap dust, hold moisture, and slowly, painfully transform rock into something slightly more hospitable. They are not soil, but they are thinking about it. And so, the great microbial empire continues with no eyes, no mouths, no plans, just chemical persistence, and a total inability to take a hint.